Okay, thank you everyone for completing the poll. I am so excited you're all here at the Looking Back and Looking Forward webinar focused on cerebral palsy research with Professor Iona Novak. As I mentioned, the webinar is closed caption enabled and we've turned on transcription as an accessibility feature should you need it. My name is Jocelyn Cohen. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Engagement with Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Foundation, also known as CPARF, and we're here in New York City. It's so exciting to have you all with us right now. Nearly 120 of you signed up from countries all around the world, including the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, Japan, and Canada, just to name a few. And as many of you know, cerebral palsy is the most common lifelong physical disability in the world, but it's vastly underfunded. We're on a mission to change that, and that also means the research we do fund is all the more crucial. Cerebral palsy research is truly a global effort. At CPARF, we fund 5 research areas across the lifespan. These include early detection and early intervention, chronic pain, technology, regenerative medicine, and genomics. Professor Novak, the Cerebral Palsy Alliance Chair of Allied Health, will take us through some of those research areas in depth, along with a brief history of cerebral palsy research, how we got here, and what's potentially in store as we move forward. I want to personally thank her for taking time out of her morning to be with us and share this information with us. After Professor Novak speaks, we'll have time for a live Q&A session, and we've already had some questions come through, so do make sure you stick around. Now, please welcome Professor Iona Novak.
Hello, or g'day, as we like to say in Australia. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I wish I was with you in person, but this is fun to be doing a webinar. Let me begin by introducing you to Jake here on screen. I first met Jake when he was 12 weeks old, and his mother had sent me an email. She'd found me on the internet and said, my son has had a difficult start to life and they suspect there's a possibility he had to have cerebral palsy, but I want to know for sure as a mother, can you help me? And I met him and we were able to do some tests, and yes, he does have cerebral palsy, and he's a delightful young man who participates well in school these days. So I want to tell you a little bit about our story of looking forwards and looking back. So United States and Australia has had a long history around the topic of cerebral palsy. And in 1945, an Australian family called the McLeods were given the diagnosis of that their daughter, Audrey, had cerebral palsy. And they were told in that era, as it was, to take her home, to love her, and to let her die. And fortunately, these were very courageous parents who really didn't accept that information at all. And they got on a mission. They lived in Perth, Australia, and they tried to get to the United States. But it was 1945, and so they only made it as far as Sydney because of the war. And not to let their efforts stopped by finding an American doctor to help them, they started an agency, which at the time was called the Spastic Centre. And you can see here in this photograph, as was the era, the dads built the buildings, and here are some of the clients, and the mothers did the therapy. And they wanted a different future for their children. And they lived by this motto, nothing is impossible. And I still live by that motto today. And I want to take you through a little bit of a journey that we've had in research and why I think the McLeods were right all along. So cerebral palsy is a physical disability. It affects movement, it affects posture, but it can also affect other things, such as you might have co-occurring epilepsy, you might have co-occurring intellectual disability or a vision impairment or a hearing impairment. And sometimes the things that come along with cerebral palsy can be more severe than actually the cerebral palsy itself. So we started on a journey of wanting to give babies like Jake the best early start. And I'm going to tell you some of these things. So the first one we started to think about was diagnosis. So the facts are that cerebral palsy is diagnosed normally between 12 and 24 months of age. And so that actually makes it a late diagnosis when you think here, and you look on this slide, that for 80% of people with cerebral palsy, the injury to the brain affecting movement happens sometime during pregnancy. And you fast forward along to 12 to 24 months after that injury, and then you're getting a diagnosis, on average around 19 months. So I want you to imagine for a moment, if you left this webinar today, and I hope it doesn't happen, but imagine you had a stroke and you went to hospital and you lost the use of your right arm and your left arm and you lost your speech. And the medical team at the hospital said to you, how about we wait 2 years and let's just see if there's any resulting damage from the stroke? I think you'd be pretty horrified and think you'd chosen the wrong hospital and that something else should surely be able to be done. And that's the same sort of questions we asked about cerebral palsy. So historically, they talked about this silent period from, birth through to 2 years or over 12 months. And that's because humans, when they're born, can't walk. So it might be very easy to see if you had a stroke that you can no longer walk, you can no longer talk. But when we're talking about a newborn who hasn't yet learned to walk or talk, it's much more difficult to see whether you have a permanent movement disorder. And so people thought of this as a historical silent period where we couldn't, we just had to wait and see. Now, this really bothered me as a clinical researcher, because at that 6-month point in the human, that's when the brain and the spinal cord finish growing the connection. So for all other animals, if you think about like dogs or horses that can walk on day 1, the connection between the brain and the spinal cord is finished at birth. But in infants, human infants, it's not finished till 6 months. And for me, that means there's this huge window of opportunity for building movement skills. And we were losing that opportunity by having a late diagnosis to cerebral palsy. And I put this figure up here, 21%, only 21% of babies with cerebral palsy got a diagnosis before 6 months of age from our population register in Australia. And it's pretty much the same number worldwide, suggesting that less than a quarter of children were getting their full potential. So we wanted to write this story in a different way. It's called early intervention, but in fact, I think it's really should be called late intervention for cerebral palsy. And it's what we call low dose. So what I mean by that there's not really very much therapy, considering how capable children are of learning to move. I don't know if you knew this, but the average baby who is typically developing when they're learning to walk falls 17 times an hour when they're learning to walk. Now, we probably don't let any child with a physical disability who's learning to walk fall 17 times a week, let alone 17 times an hour. But ironically, they probably need to fall more than 17 times because they need the extra practice because their motor system or movement system isn't working as well as a typically developing child. And so that's why I was calling it late intervention that was low dose. And this is the problem that we wanted to solve. Another thing that really concerned me is when we looked at the International Clinical Practice Guideline for adults that had a stroke, it was recommended that they had 14 hours of therapy to retrain their movement and speech in the first fortnight after the stroke. And when we looked at how much therapy children with cerebral palsy were getting, they were on average getting 14 hours in the first year. So again, I felt it was underdosed and not maximising children's potential. So we started to rectify this problem. I led a group of 40 amazing international authors from all different disciplines, including parents of children with cerebral palsy and people with cerebral palsy. And together we worked on an international clinical practice guideline that found a way to diagnose cerebral palsy early and accurately. People were afraid that they might make a mistake with the diagnosis because you couldn't yet see walking and you couldn't yet see talking. But we found a way to do it. And we published this guideline in 2017. And what it's done is it's meant that the age of diagnosis has dropped from 2 years of age down to 3 months of age. And remember, I was telling you about that golden window from 0 to 6 months of age where the brain and the spinal cord is still connecting. So now we can diagnose children inside that golden window in order to maximize their potential from all sorts of different interventions. We went further and we took this work further, and we knew that children with cerebral palsy, no two are the same, and that often means that different things happen on different tests. And because the condition can be very mild, from a fisted hand through to quite severe, where a person might need help for all kinds of mobility, help for all kinds of self-care at home, we wanted to look at a range of tests. And what we found in our study, we worked with the Italians and we looked at their data, and we found that if you combine 3 tests, a brain scan, an MRI, plus a test called the general movements, that is a video of the baby's quality of movement, plus a test called the Hammersmith Infant Neurological Examination, or the HIND for short, when you combine those, and all 3 tests are indicating the child has cerebral palsy, there's a 98% chance the child in front of you really does have cerebral palsy. And this has been a game changer in terms of an early and an accurate diagnosis. I'm going to move now to talking about how common is cerebral palsy. So Jocelyn told you in the introduction, it's the most common physical disability of childhood worldwide. Over 17 million people are affected. So we'll go back in time because we're looking back and looking forward. In 2013, there was this very important paper published from Canada that looked at how many people have cerebral palsy. And it showed 2.1 per every 1,000 babies born, so which is about 1 in 500, 1 in 400 really. And it was showing that the rate around the world was stable. And we knew from data in Australia that the rate had been stable for about 60 years. Looking forward a little bit, we were able to publish this data from our Cerebral Palsy Register in Australia, showing that going forward to 2018, that the rate of cerebral palsy had dropped, and it had dropped by an amazing 30%. It was down to 1.4 per 1,000 births. And so that's 1 in 700 babies, not 1 in 400 babies. And so what was really important about this data was that it was a 30% reduction in the rate of a condition that people had said, well, I don't think it can be prevented, and I don't think we can change the course of this condition. So this is a very important finding. In addition, we also started to wonder, well, of these people being born with cerebral palsy, was their life different to those born at 2013? And I'll tell you a bit about that story. But how did we make the rate go down? Well, there are 4 key interventions given early that help make the rate of cerebral palsy go down, and they give babies the best chance of a good start to life. So one of them is something called magnesium sulfate, which you might know better as a product called bath salts. But actually, when it's prepared medically and given through an intravenous line to a mother just about to have an imminent delivery of a preterm baby, it helps protect the baby's brain and prevents as much as 30% of cerebral palsy in premature babies. In addition, something called antenatal, which just means pregnancy, corticosteroids. And we know that babies born very early haven't yet finished developing their lungs, and lungs are very important for delivering oxygen to the brain. So if we give the babies corticosteroids while the mother is still pregnant, it can assist with the lung development and can also protect the brain. So these 2 interventions in pregnancy help babies have a good start to life, and we call them green light interventions. Another intervention that is important is after the baby's born, if they're born prematurely or born quite sick and they're in the intensive care unit, we know of 2 interventions that also help change the rate of cerebral palsy. And the first one is called hypothermia. So when a baby's having a brain injury, if we actually cool their whole body down and we give them pain medication so it doesn't feel uncomfortable, but we cool their body down for a couple of days, just below what would be normal human temperature, it actually interrupts a brain injury, and that prevents cerebral palsy in about 15% of cases. And of course, for someone like me, I'm interested in what about the other group of people that hypothermia didn't work for. And one of the things it can also, that's a force driving our research forward. How can we help everyone? And the next thing that we think about is caffeine. So not just coffee. I don't know if you're a coffee aficionado like I am, but coffee not just for parents or with tired babies, but also caffeine for babies. So we can prepare caffeine medically and give it to babies. And it also helps protect the brain from injury or over-oxygenation. But the story isn't the same the world over. And I know we have people from all around the world today. So we have seen this amazing drop in the rate of cerebral palsy in high-income countries. We've also been working with very talented researchers in a country called Bangladesh. And you can see that the rate here is much, much higher. It's 3.41 thousand, which is almost 2.5 times higher than the rate of cerebral palsy in a country like Australia. And this is very important that we've started this register here and are collecting this data, because what we've found out is that many of these children have potentially modifiable risk factors. So what do I mean by that? Obviously, in a high-income country, obstetric care and intensive care is probably quite different to in a low-income country. Also, control of infection during pregnancy and things like that, which are done routinely in a high-income country, there could be more work focused on that in a low-income country. And so we have the opportunity to change the rate and change the course of people's lives in Bangladesh. So another aspect to the story was, I remember I said in 2013 it was 1 in 400 and now it's 1 in 700. We also wanted to look at the 1 in 700. Was their type of cerebral palsy different to how it was in 2013 or for the last 60 years indeed? And we published this study that showed that actually the severity of cerebral palsy is now lessening. And so what do I mean by that? If you look at this old data in the first column here, back in 1984, half of all people with cerebral palsy could walk and half of them used a wheelchair. If you fast forward to the last column on the right there, you can see that 3/4 of them now can walk and only 1/4 of them use a wheelchair. So what did this early interventions during pregnancy and the neonatal period is telling us that even if you have cerebral palsy, you're more likely to have a milder form than in previous years. And for me, that means many things. First of all, it obviously means you're more likely to walk and you're more likely to talk. But it also means because you have a smaller brain injury or an injury in a less critical area, you're more likely to respond to intervention. And we know then that neuroplasticity must be harnessed and to help children reach their potential. Again, though, I wanted to point out the story is not exactly the same all over the world, and the sort of country you live in does make a difference. So if we look at the rate in Australia there, where 1/4 of people use a wheelchair, it's almost half in Bangladesh. So this is giving us clues about how to help people in Bangladesh and other low-income countries. So if we come now to thinking about the causes of cerebral palsy. Historically, people thought cerebral palsy was 100% of the time a birth injury, that it was an obstetric care failure that led to a loss of oxygen during birth. And this was the working hypothesis in Australia too. It was the working hypothesis, in fact, all around the world. And on this graph, I want to show you the rates of caesarean section. So this is the aim where the doctor delivers the baby via caesarean section in order to prevent cerebral palsy. And what you can see here is that the rate of caesarean section went up a lot over time. It went from under 5% to over 35% in Australia. However, at the same time, the rate of cerebral palsy stayed exactly the same. So we were doing more caesarean sections, but it was having no impact on the rate of cerebral palsy. And this was the first clue that we had that maybe cerebral palsy wasn't all a birth injury. It wasn't all malpractice at the obstetric care level. And when you find the opportunity to look in a different way at a problem, you start to find other solutions. So I'm going to tell you about some of those. So the first additional clue we started to look at here was from the cerebral palsy registers. How many people with cerebral palsy also had something called a congenital anomaly, or which used to be called a birth defect? maybe a change in their heart wasn't born normally, or a change in their brain, or maybe they were missing a limb, for example. And we found that somewhat surprisingly, 28% of people with cerebral palsy also had some type of congenital anomaly. Now, if you think about this story before, where we're talking about people assuming that cerebral palsy was a birth injury, a birth defect simply can't happen in the last 1 or 2 hours of pregnancy. It has to happen a long time through the pregnancy. And that gave us another clue that maybe we'd been looking in the wrong place. Maybe we'd been looking at the wrong timing. The next thing that was very important on this story was that up until 2014, we understood that about 1% of people with cerebral palsy had some type of genetic predisposition to cerebral palsy. And we knew this because 1% of people on the Australian Cerebral Palsy Register had a family member who also had cerebral palsy. So we knew there was some genetic link. However, we thought it was very small and very uncommon in most cases. However, from the Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Foundation, we funded 2 groups of researchers to start looking at genetics. And this was after the time where scientists had mapped the human genome, and there's this genetic revolution going on in medicine. And we thought people with cerebral palsy shouldn't miss out. And we looked at 2 groups, and what they actually found that as much as 30% of all people with cerebral palsy might have some genetic basis to their condition. So we funded a group in Australia who looked at over 800 cases, and they looked at both the parent's DNA and the child's DNA, and a group in Canada did a very similar thing. And they surprisingly found at least up to 20%, and it's now thought up to 30% might have some genetic change. And I want to show you this new paper that we recently wrote in Nature Genetics, and it has this curious linkage when we talk about the genetics story. So here in this Venn diagram, the blue circle relates to cerebral palsy, and there are nearly 300 genes that might be related to the pathway to cerebral palsy. Then the orange is intellectual disability, the green circle is epilepsy, and the yellow circle is autism spectrum disorder. If you look in the middle where all 4 circles overlap, you will see that there are 10 genes in common between these 4 conditions. And these are what we call candidate genes, and that we know that they're very important for brain development. So this gives us a lot of other clues about how to think about cerebral palsy, in terms of about 1/3 of people with cerebral palsy also have epilepsy. And so that story starts to make sense. About 8% of people with cerebral palsy also have autism spectrum disorder. So this story starts to make sense. And about 30% of people with cerebral palsy also have an intellectual disability. So this gives us another set of clues of where to look. Now, when we're thinking about what genes might tell us, I want to tell you about a story in a different condition called spinal muscular atrophy. This is a young man who interviewed in the newspaper, and the heading of the article was, "I have spinal muscular atrophy. Critics of the $2 million new gene therapy are missing the point." So let me tell you what he's talking about. Spinal muscular atrophy is a fatal disorder, and usually children start out with normal development, and then they very sadly lose the ability to walk and to talk. And for many, there are different types of the disorder, but for many it's fatal. Now, very recently, medical researchers, because they did the same thing we've done in cerebral palsy, they're looking at the map genome in which genes are important, they developed something called a gene therapy. So it's where you can edit the gene and actually give the faulty component a normal component, and it corrects the whole DNA of the person. So in this case, it's a very important drug. And he said, sure, it's the world's priciest drug, but let's focus on the needs of the patients. I really like this guy. He said, we shouldn't put a price tag on a life. $2.1 million is not too much to spend for that baby's survival. And I like where he's going with this. There is a great excitement from Having the possibility of understanding genes means the possibility of gene therapies. So in the last 5 years, this fatal disease where I, as a health professional, used to help families learn through their grief of how to support their child while they were dying, now I'm the sort of person that can help their child learn to go to school, how to stay walking, and many of these different things. It's an extraordinary different pathway for these families. And we think that the same pathway might be possible for cerebral palsy in the future. And that's why we study genes at our agency. Another thing that we've been studying is another causal path to cerebral palsy, so infections during pregnancy. So there are many different infections that can happen to the mother during pregnancy. So the common flu would be one of them. And of course, you're probably wondering about coronavirus as well. And there's been a lot of discussion in the media about whether coronavirus does cross the placenta and whether the baby is protected or whether the baby gets coronavirus. And we're always concerned about viruses during pregnancy because they can affect brain development and they can interrupt oxygen flow to the baby. So, for example, there's a curious thing going on right now with coronavirus that, in fact, the rate of preterm birth or premature birth has substantially dropped worldwide while we've all been in isolation. So we're also wondering, does that mean, and that's because mothers haven't been exposed to lots of infection, they've been at home, does this also mean we might see an extra drop in the rate of cerebral palsy because of all this social isolation that we've been doing? We don't know, but we're going to be studying that. The second component here is there is a virus called cytomegalovirus, and we call it CMV for short. That is a common virus that mutates and rotates around the community. And so we wanted to see whether we could help prevent this virus during pregnancy. And so simple steps to infection control, which you're all very familiar with these days, of hand washing, not sharing cutlery, social distancing, and cleaning surfaces. We all know that they can help prevent coronavirus, but they also prevent many other viruses during infections during pregnancy, and they're healthy for babies. And they're simple things we can all do to help. I want to come to the last section of this talk, looking at some of the new treatments available for cerebral palsy for people living with the condition. And the first one, again, is a really early one. It's something called erythropoietin, or EPO for short. Now, if you're a sports tragic, you might have heard of EPO. Lance Armstrong is pretty famous for using EPO. EPO is actually something that naturally occurs in our bodies. It helps us make red blood cells. Now, of course, if you're a cyclist going uphill for 3 weeks in the Tour de France, it's a very helpful outcome to have more red blood cells because you can have more oxygen and exercise harder. However, what's the correlation between that and cerebral palsy? Well, in fact, when you have a brain injury, your body naturally sends erythropoietin to the site of the injury to try and make more red blood cells in order to try and self-repair your own brain. So our hypothesis was, what happens if we were to give an extra dose, so a clinical dose, on top of what your brain naturally was producing, to see whether that would help lessen the size of a brain injury. And what we found in these clinical trials for babies that were at 100% risk of cerebral palsy is that they had less brain injury, and that at one, they had better movement. So we think of this as an important early treatment. The next one I want to move to is something called stem cells. There are 5 different stem cells that are under investigation for cerebral palsy. Those stem cells do different jobs. Some of them dampen inflammation, and if you can dampen brain inflammation, you can reduce the size of an injury. Some of those cells actually help repair the brain. So we're wondering, could they make new pathways in the brain so you could learn to do the sorts of things you wanted to do? And our group had a look at all of the stem cell trials for cerebral palsy. So now over in the last 15 years, 2,400 children with cerebral palsy have had stem cell treatments in clinical trials. And of course, that number would be much higher if we could look at the numbers from private clinics that are actually selling cells. But of the 2,400 where we can transparently see the data, we found a couple of things. First of all, and most importantly, that stem cells are safe for people with cerebral palsy. We also found that in the clinical trials where people got stem cells plus rehabilitation versus those that got rehabilitation alone, the group that had the add-on stem cells had somewhat better movement than those from rehabilitation. And altogether, what this work tells us is that more research is worthwhile. There is some research going on in the United States, some in Australia, and other places in the world looking at which are the best stem cell lines and what sort of treatment size effects could we expect from stem cells. And I think this work is important. It's stem cells are here to stay, and we will hopefully find out what are the optimum doses, the optimum timing as we keep continuing this work. And the last piece I want to come to is the prevention of complications. So even though the brain injury that causes cerebral palsy doesn't change over time, the person with cerebral palsy's body can change over time. So they can have early onset aging, they can have complications such as changes in their skeleton shape, causing a scoliosis or a hip dislocation. They can have changes in their muscles, and their muscles get short. So all of us have growing pains when we're growing, but if you have cerebral palsy, just like any other child, your bones grow faster than your muscles. And if your muscles are already a little bit short at a disadvantage, they just simply don't keep up with your bones growing fast. And so you can end up with very short muscles causing joint changes, and it can be very painful. So these are the sort of complications we see with cerebral palsy, and most of them are preventable. And I wanted to show you this data from Sweden, where they also have a very big register, and there's one there in Norway and Denmark that also have the same data. So if you start by looking on the left-hand side, and let's start with the blue line, which is hip dislocation. So back in the 90s, in their countries, about 10% of people had a hip dislocation, and that's pretty common worldwide. That's the rate we would expect to see currently in the United States and in Australia. About 30% of people, their hip, what we call subluxes, so it's on the way to dislocation. It hasn't arrived at dislocation, but it's going, unfortunately, in that direction. So 10% of these people had already had hip dislocations, and you can see by the time they implemented their follow-up program of surveillance and active therapy that there was 0 cases in Sweden. And in fact, they ended up with 1 case because someone immigrated to Sweden. And again, they did this remarkable work. So the orange line is what we call contraction. So that means the muscles are too short, pulling the joints into abnormal positions. And the green line is scoliosis, so a twist in the spine. And you can see they were also able to substantially reduce these complications of cerebral palsy from active surveillance. So one of the things we're very interested in at Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Foundation is work that regularly monitors people so they get the right treatments at the right time, at the right dose, so that we can prevent complications. So in conclusion, we are now able to diagnose cerebral palsy very early. It used to be diagnosed at 2, it can now be diagnosed at 3 months of age. We've seen a 30% fall in the rate of cerebral palsy, and severity is lessening, meaning that more people than ever before can respond to interventions. We've identified new causes of cerebral palsy, meaning that we have new target areas where we can think about different interventions that will give a good and different start to life. We can prevent complications, and there are many new treatments being tested in clinical trials. So I think when the McLeods said nothing is impossible, they really were right. The future is very bright for people with cerebral palsy. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to taking some questions.
Thank you so much, Iona. I know a lot from working at CPAR for the last 2 years, and I feel like I just learned a ton of information. So again, I really appreciate you coming out. I'm going to head to one of the questions that came in before the webinar, which is, can you explain how rehabilitation is supposed to work in children and adults with cerebral palsy? What does it change in the brain? And can research with modern imaging techniques help us understand this?
That's a really great question, and there's a lot to it. So let me start with the first aspect of that. How does rehabilitation work for children and adults? So definitely we all have plasticity. We're lifelong learners as humans. Certainly in the first 2 years of life, you can learn many things. So we all understand that children, are not born to learn English. They can learn many languages in that 0 to 2 area. You can always learn a language at any point in your life, but it's easier when you're younger. So there's a different type of plasticity in the first 2 years of life. It's a possibility plasticity, if you like, and later on we refine things, and so we can always learn. So rehabilitation is important throughout the lifespan. However, I want to say rehabilitation is not about fixing a person. It's not about making them look like another person in society. It's really focused on sort of rehabilitation that works is asking the person with cerebral palsy, what is it that you want to learn to do, or what is it that's important to you, and let's match the rehabilitation plan to helping you reach your goals. And our goals, as you know, would change over life. So maybe when you're under 2, your main focus in life is to get an ice cream or gelato or something, whereas when you're an adult, maybe the most important thing to you is to have a reduction in pain. And so rehabilitation can look really different at different age ranges, partly because of plasticity, but mostly because our goals change as well. So what I want to say to that is that how we choose the rehabilitations that actually work is we begin by understanding the person's goal, and then next by looking at the sort of treatments that might help achieve that goal. So we have, I showed you some bubbles, or I called them green light interventions for things that work in the early period. We actually have the whole of the 180 interventions available for cerebral palsy on a map, and they're color-coded like that with traffic lights, so you can see which ones might help reach the goal that you're talking about. And so some of them are green, some of them are red, and most of them are yellow, meaning they're promising treatments. And so that's how we sort of think about it. What is it you want to do? And that's select the evidence-based treatment. So in terms of plasticity, if you want to refine something, you can certainly do that as an adult, but if you're a newborn, you can certainly learn to do many things. And so the intensity of the therapy might be a lot more because your capability for learning might be a lot more. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an insight into that. And then the second part of the question was, would advanced MRI help with these things? Well, one of the things MRI does is, I like to say to parents, it tells you the postcode or the zip code of the injury, but it doesn't tell you how you're going to live in your house. You get to decide that as a person, what matters to you, what's important to you, and how you live. So advanced MRI is very helpful for telling us the location of the injury, that yes, it's on that, maybe the connection between the brain and the spinal cord injury affecting movement. And so it tells us you're going to have cerebral palsy. It can also tell us a little bit about how severe the cerebral palsy might be going to be, but it's not going to dictate your life. You get to decide that, whatever matters to you. And so MRI is useful for diagnosis. It's useful for prognosis. And we're almost getting to the point where MRI can tell us whether a treatment worked, because we can look at very detailed maps that look at connectivity, that new connectivity started after a new treatment. However, connectivity is a bit of a so what, unless it's actually really giving the person with cerebral palsy something that they want to achieve. So I always think of brain MRI. It's very important. It looks very magical. However, the most important thing to do is to ask the person with cerebral palsy, is this giving you the gains that matter to you? And whether the MRI is same or different is a little bit irrelevant. It's most important whether it's making changes for the person.
Thank you for that. The next question came from our Q&A live, and the question is as follows. EPO has a number of side effects on the athlete population, as you mentioned. Are you seeing similar side effects when it is used as a CP treatment?
That's a great question about erythropoietin. Actually, very interestingly, EPO performs very differently in adults to the way it performs in newborns. So we were using this in babies that were less than a day old. And so the side effect profile is really quite different in young babies. And actually, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States has a different safety rating for EPO for adults than it does for children. Children respond very differently to EPO. So that's important. Children are never little adults. They're always different people. And that's very important for us to remember in clinical trials. So we know we're not really seeing very many side effects from this medication.
Thank you for that. The next question builds, I guess, a little bit off the first one that you answered. Someone asked, what's the best intervention for children with a spastic quadriplegia diagnosis?
Yeah, so the best interventions for spastic quadriplegia, I would kind of answer this the same way. It depends on the person. And I think two people could have exactly the same spastic quadriplegia, meaning all four limbs are affected. However, they might have really different goals in life of what they want to do. So we begin with the goals. I think it's really determined by what it is. So some people with spastic quadriplegia it would be common that they say they want a reduction in pain, for example, and that we know substantially improves a person's quality of life with spastic quadriplegia. Some people with spastic quadriplegia might want an independent mobility option. So maybe they can take a few steps in a walker, but it's so exhausting that it really costs them that, it takes them an hour to get from the classroom to the library at school instead of 2 minutes. And so they lose things from walking. So for them, maybe powered mobility, so electric wheelchair is actually a more helpful option because it promotes inclusion. But these choices are different between every person. People with spastic quadriplegia also often ask us about communication. So they often have a high acceptance that my body doesn't exactly do what I tell it to do, but what's really important for me is that I'm able to talk or communicate with a device with other people. And we know that working on communication and independence in that area can be incredibly important for full inclusion in life. So the answer will vary depending on the person. I think historically, if we're looking back and looking forwards here, a lot of intervention was given to people with spastic quadriplegia of trying to relax their muscles, using either medications or stretching. A lot of focus was on trying to learn to walk. And these are the things that are very obvious symptoms, I guess. However, none of those things actually translate to independence as an adult. And so I tend to think about it as a clinician researcher from the point of view is, where do you want to be? What sort of life do you want to have? And choosing treatments that match that, not aiming for the impossible just because you look different to me, but actually asking you what it is that's really important to you.
I appreciate that answer. And building off of something you said about energy consumption, another question we have is, do you know of any research being done on CP-related fatigue for people with cerebral palsy, like potential treatments, interventions, and the way that fatigue related to CP might change throughout the lifespan?
Yes, this is an excellent question. So I'm aware of two fields looking at fatigue from two different perspectives. So the first one, which I really like the work coming out of a PhD candidate in Norway, who's been looking at fatigue. So if you do things at your maximal physical capacity as a person with cerebral palsy. So you're walking around the classroom, you're, talking, etc., etc. So you're doing a lot of movements like other students. What does it cost you in terms of your schoolwork? So she's actually looking at, does doing all these movements cost your ability to have enough energy reserve left over to do reading and writing and things like that, and found a very strong relationship that children that were more sedentary actually had able to focus more on their schoolwork than those that were being really independent, which is maybe what all of us as clinicians thought was important, but actually was really costing them. So I think if you think of it like all of us have a bucket of energy reserve for the day. And for me, I can make a certain amount of movement movements and still have a certain amount of brain space available, RAM left to do what I need to do. But if you use up all that bucket on just walking to the classroom, then there isn't much left in the bucket for some of the other things that might matter to you more. And so weighing these things up is really important. So that sort of works, having a look at energy cost and the effect on schoolwork. I'm also aware of some groups that are looking at the actual muscles of people with cerebral palsy under the microscope after biopsy. So people that have consented to give a small tissue sample for analysis. So one thing we know about people with cerebral palsy, even though it's an injury during pregnancy and the brain injury doesn't change, the person's body can change. And one of the things we find when we look right at the muscle level is that for people with normal muscles or typically developing muscles, there's a very set tension relationship between the muscle and the tendons on the end. And it's in perfect concert to make for contraction and elongation to making movements. However, when you look inside the muscles of people with cerebral palsy, there's more fluid, there's more leakage, I guess, if you like. And so you end up with this sloppy or loose muscle. So even though it's on high tension because of spasticity, the actual structure of the muscle is loose. So if you think about something being pulled that's actually sloppy, there's a lot of energy consumption in there. And so there's energy consumption to move against that type of physics, if you like. And so these people are looking at the construction of the muscle and whether stem cell muscle cells might be helpful for repairing some things at the muscle structure level to look at energy consumption and energy fatigue management.
That is fascinating, and I appreciate it because I know several people with CP who talk about CP-related fatigue. So I'm glad people will get to learn some of this information. The next question that we have is, can you comment on the relationship between the CP incidence and prematurity?
Yes. So about 40% of people with cerebral palsy are born premature. The other 60% are born on time, or, it's 55, 60%. It varies a little bit from country to country. So we know with premature, it's what we call a risk factor. So just because you're born premature doesn't automatically mean you have cerebral palsy. About 7% of Australians that are born premature end up with cerebral palsy. It's about 10% in the United States. So it does vary a little bit. And there are higher rates of prematurity in the United States than there are in some other countries. So that's also about genetics. It's about healthcare systems, how much prematurity is going on, and then how much of that actually ends up as a risk factor for cerebral palsy. So it's a risk factor in many different ways. First of all, if you think of a baby having 9 months inside of the mother, it's getting fed consistently. The blood temperature is consistent. Everything's consistent, right? Even the noise. So a baby can hear when your mum goes to a concert that it's much louder, but it's still like they got headphones on. Everything is buffered a little bit during pregnancy. If you're born too early, you are very vulnerable because only about 2/3 of the brain development is actually finished by birth. So if you're born early, sometimes for some people, only 1/3 of the brain development is actually finished. And that can mean many things. It can mean that a noisy, loud, light neonatal intensive care unit is enough to tip a baby into a brain injury. And that's why we have quiet neonatal intensive care units with the lights off. It can mean that the blood vessels in there are very, very fragile because they haven't finished developing. So that can mean if your blood pressure drops suddenly, or you have a sudden fluctuation in your sugars, all that pressure against those very fragile vessels can actually cause them to bleed, and you can have a brain injury right there in the neonatal intensive care unit. So the interesting thing is, though, after such a rough start to life, children with cerebral palsy from a premature background usually have milder cerebral palsy than those born on time. And that really doesn't make much sense when you think about they had such a tough start to life, but it tells us that something is different is happening for those children to the children born on time. They more commonly have a type of cerebral palsy called spastic diplegia, which means di meaning two, so the two legs are mostly affected. And that's because a certain area of the brain is very vulnerable in the neonatal period to loss of oxygen. And it's close to the area that controls the legs. So that type of cerebral palsy is more common. We rarely see that in babies born on time. So we get different types of cerebral palsy. We get milder cerebral palsy, but it is a very big risk factor.
Thank you for that. Again, I learned something just from your answer there, so I appreciate that. The next question we have is, what can be causes of pain for someone with CP, and what can be done to prevent the pain? Thank you.
That's such an important question. So pain management for me is one of the most important things we can do. And I take an approach with people with cerebral palsy and pain, that pain, I take it as guilty until proven innocent. And so what I mean by that is 3/4 of people with cerebral palsy experience chronic pain. So I always, as a clinician, assume pain is there and work backwards, whereas most people sort of sometimes ask a person with cerebral palsy if they do or don't have pain. It's sort of a background issue, but I think it's really important that we assume it's there and look at it. Now, pain, there are multiple causes of pain in a person with cerebral palsy. So there could be muscle pain from overactivity, as Jocelyn's been talking about, this incredible fatigue from just working out, just getting across the classroom. It could be that your joints are under enormous pressure because your muscles are too short, and so you're getting joint pain. So these are what we call musculoskeletal pains. Though there is the two common types of pain, actually the contraction or the overactivity of some muscles called spasticity or dystonia, that can actually be painful as well. Dystonia particularly causes twisting motions, which can be very painful. So those are tone causes, but we see other causes as well. So sometimes people just think about the cerebral palsy and they don't think about general health. And so dental pain is quite a common source of pain as well, not thinking about getting the person's teeth cared for, or the fact that they have abnormal facial movements may cause grinding of the teeth and different teeth fractures and those sorts of things that can be painful. We see gastrointestinal pain as a very common source of pain. So we do know now in modern medicine that there is a strong link between the gut and the brain as well. So it's not surprising probably that there's a lot of gut pain in cerebral palsy. We know that people with abnormal postures sometimes find it difficult to have bowel and bladder emptying, so that can be a cause of pain. However, there does seem to also be that the control of the diaphragm and other muscles in the abdomen are affected, and so you can see causes of pain there. So reflux is a common cause of pain, and other food processing issues. There are others, but the important point of this answer is that pain is almost always present. It's almost always multifactorial. So you have to put your detective hat on and see if you can identify the sources of pain, because obviously a dental treatment is quite different to a muscle treatment. So there's no point just giving an analgesic and hoping it all goes away. You need to be quite specific in thinking. But there is a really wonderful clinical practice guideline on the Holland Bloorview site, which is Rehabilitation Hospital in Canada, of how to manage pain. It's a beautiful set of resources, and I would strongly encourage people use that, because we know in cerebral palsy two things about pain. One is parents often underreport the amount of pain, and that's not anything wrong with that. It's just that children perhaps don't talk about their pain a lot. Maybe it's so normal for them that they don't actually talk about pain. So it's always important to ask the person themselves about pain. And the second thing is, we know pain and pain management is strongly related to quality of life. So those with lower pain have higher quality of life. And so it's very important that we do address pain.
Thank you for that. We have about 3 minutes left, so I have one more question, and that is, what do you believe are the keys to getting more people around the world to research cerebral palsy?
That's one of my pet topics, getting people involved. So one of the things we've done at Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Foundation is to actually embrace the paradoxical power of generosity and actually give money to people to do cerebral palsy research. So normally researchers, they keep all their own money and they make sure that they're the best group in the world studying things. And I had an early thought in our group, I don't think it's all going to happen in Sydney, Australia. I'm sure there's many global thinkers that could contribute. So one of the things we do is we fundraise and raise money and give that money under competitive grant schemes to the best researchers all over the world. We don't worry about location. We're looking for the best minds to solve these problems. So we ask people with cerebral palsy, what are your research priorities? And we find the best minds all over the world. And I think that's been key. So some of the things that we've seen is when we started this work in Australia, for example, only $1 million a year was spent 15 years ago on cerebral palsy, which for the number of people with cerebral palsy was about $30 a head, which probably buys you lunch, not really a good new treatment. And so we really thought if you put more money in the field, we would find more talent. And now you see that Cerebral Palsy Alliance Research Foundation gives over $60 million to researchers all over the world. And there's a big change in outcomes because of that. And I think that this progress that I'm talking about today is largely because of those extraordinary efforts of philanthropic donors that have supported this work. It makes this sort of work possible.
Thank you so much for that. It's a great way to close out and just thank everyone for being here. I know there are some questions that we didn't get to, so I will send those to Professor Novak and hopefully she can get some answers to you. And just following up on what Professor Novak just said, if you'd like to give back in an instant to help move cerebral palsy research forward, you can do that now. You just text research to 707070 and get started. We hope you'll join us for future events like this one. We appreciate any gifts you might be able to make. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on where you're living right now. Thank you so much.